Hello everyone, and welcome to Chapter 11. Chapter 11 deals with managing intercultural conflict, and in this chapter we will be looking at different perceptions of conflict, different ways of approaching conflict, and the most effective ways to manage conflict in terms of mutually satisfying outcomes. So let's get started. So the different paradigms of intercultural conflict can be explained through various lenses, and as you all are aware of, we have already been drawing from the social science perspective, the interpretive perspective, and of course the critical perspective of communication this semester. So each of these perspectives brings a different view of conflict and what conflict means to people, and so we're going to go through each of these one by one. The social science perspective assumes that cultural differences within the individuals cause conflict. And of course, based on the social science paradigm, because people tend to have different perceptions of issues based on their culture, and because they tend to approach conflict differently depending on cultural background, these types of culture background issues will influence how people cope and manage with conflict. However, the interpretive perspective assumes that people interpret conflict differently and that it may not only be the background cultural issues that we have that shape how we view conflict, but it may also, or more importantly, may primarily be the interpretations that we assign to conflict, which influence how we end up perceiving it and managing and coping with conflict. The interpretive perspective also accounts for the fact that intergroup relations is something that always needs to be considered whenever we are considering an issue related to conflict. And so more specifically, we can look at things like the history between various groups in society. We can look at what kinds of conflicts this group or that group has had with each other or with other groups. We can look at some of the ongoing thematic issues that certain groups might be facing in terms of dealing with conflict. So for example, the interpretive perspective would allow us to look at things like, let's say, civil rights movements in the USA, and we could look at things like race relations and the history of race relations in the United States. And from the interpretive perspective, if we were going to try to explain or make sense of conflict that is taking place now, in 2015 or 2020, right, we would also have to go back 30, 40, 50, 100 years to look at the ways in which history has shaped communication between the groups that are having the conflict today, okay? And finally, the critical perspective allows us to account for more broader macro, cultural, historical, or structural issues that can shape the way that relationships between groups play out, the way that certain groups may have access to certain resources or things like that. And of course, those types of larger structural issues would say a good deal about why it is that certain groups tend to experience the world in one way, whereas other groups in society, namely the groups that are less privileged or have less advantages, tend to experience life or conflict specifically in a different way, okay? So the social science view, the interpretive view, and the critical view allow us to look at conflict from different lenses. So each of these perspectives is valuable, and one is not correct, and two are not incorrect, but instead what we want to do is we want to really get a sense of what each paradigm brings to the understanding of conflict, because all of these different lenses that we can use to understand conflict allow us to paint a more holistic picture about what is taking place, what the historical issues are that are playing out, and of course, what are some broader cultural or structural issues that are shaping the interactions between groups as well. When looking at different types of contexts of conflict, we can look at conflict starting from the most internal conflict, going to the most broad or macro or group-based conflict, okay? So when we talk about internal conflict, we're looking at something called intrapersonal conflict. Intrapersonal conflict deals with conflicts that we might actually have going on within ourselves, right? So some of the time you may be dealing with internal dialogues or internal issues with regards to whether you should pursue one course of action or another. Maybe you're dealing with some intrapersonal conflict, dealing with bicultural identity issues or different types of cultural or identity issues that maybe sometimes oppose each other, right? And maybe you're having a hard time reconciling those different camps of thinking or those different lifestyles that you're trying to sort of integrate. That would be an example of intrapersonal conflict. However, we can also look at conflict in terms of interpersonal conflict between people, right? So an interpersonal conflict would usually be a conflict that's playing out between two people who are in a relationship. Maybe this might be a romantic relationship. It could be a friendship. It could be a work relationship that has gone beyond just a normal routine organizational interaction. This could also deal with sibling relationships in a family household. You might look at parent-child relationships from an interpersonal lens, okay? Generally speaking, when we're looking at interpersonal, we're looking at 2 to 3 people who have a established relationship in the past and who have a relationship that is likely to continue in the future. We can also look at conflict from a more familial perspective. So as many of you probably have experienced in your life, many of us come from different backgrounds in terms of our family values and the way that we have been raised or the way that communication takes place within the family. And so these family issues can shape how we communicate and can also contribute to conflicts. So when you have people, for example, within the same family unit who have very different expectations about how communication and boundaries and punishment or things like that should be taking place, this could be a site of conflict, right? And in fact, one of the things we know about, let's say, interreligious marriages or interracial marriages is that they tend to be characterized by a higher degree of familial conflicts because of these background issues. So family conflicts are definitely a type of conflict context that we want to be conscious of. In addition, maybe some of you have even experienced this in your time going to college or at various workplaces. Conflict also does play out in work or organizational communication environments or even in educational communication environments. And so anytime you have groups of people who are coming together to achieve a common goal, and of course we know that people come from different backgrounds, they have different expectations about the way things should take place and the way people should behave, right? And so these differences in expectations, of course, can contribute to conflicts in the work or in the educational interactions. Also, we can look at conflict from a broader social or political level. So we can look at social conflicts that might be taking place between groups. We could look at conflicts related to race or religious groups. We might also look at conflicts that are taking place between political entities or political factions, right? Now, sometimes you have an overlap between social and political conflicts, right? And so these different types of conflict contexts are intended to provide a guidance for you in terms of understanding what types of context might be contributing to the conflict. However, it's not always the case that every conflict is in a very neat package. So it's possible, for example, that you could be having a political conflict with someone and it may be an interpersonal relationship, right? So it's important to be aware of these different contexts. And of course, with that awareness, it allows us to understand the situation more clearly and of course understand perhaps our own role in the situation and how other people are contributing to it as well. And once we understand those background differences a little bit better, we can understand why it is that we approach things in a certain way, and hopefully we can move towards a more common middle ground to resolve conflicts in a more optimum outcome. The conflict orientations that people have influence the way that they view conflict and, of course, how they deal with conflict once they encounter it. People who have a conflict as destructive orientation tend to view conflict as highly destructive. They see it as a process that disturbs the peace, and generally speaking, they view conflict as something that is ineffective. The viewpoint of people who tend to come from conflict as destructive orientations tends to be that other people or people within the system that they're living in should adapt to the current way that the system deals with things and should not create conflict based on differences of opinions or differences of preferred activities. According to this orientation, people within the system or people that are joining the system who behave in ways that are conflict-based, so maybe they start arguments or try to argue their point or things like that. According to the conflict as destructive orientation, people who dispute should be disciplined. So these are people who are not adapting to the system, and from this orientation, there is a type of social sanctioning that takes place, either formal or informal, whereby people who do not adapt to the current system that they are in should be socially disciplined or interpersonally disciplined or should be made to feel bad or guilty or wrong for bringing about conflict, okay? Now, this orientation, conflict as destructive, is one perspective of conflict, but as we know, there is also a perspective called the conflict as opportunity perspective, and this perspective is very different. The conflict as opportunity perspective views conflict as something that is normal, necessary, and in fact useful in human relationships. And of course, from this perspective, we can say that issues are viewed as negotiable, meaning that even if we have different perceptions or expectations or views on an issue, we can talk about those things through communication, and of course, we can learn to adapt to each other based on those differences so that we can come forth with a more functional, collaborative outcome. From the conflict orientation as opportunity, various issues are viewed as confrontational in that the ability to confront issues is something that's valued by people from the conflict as opportunity orientation. And of course, when we say confront issues, what we mean is someone who's willing to identify that there is a problem in the situation. They're willing to talk about the problem. They're willing to come up with potential solutions for the problem. And of course, from the conflict as opportunity perspective, we can look at the fact that renegotiation, or what do we do later on in time once we've already dealt with the conflict, when we want to see how effective is this coping strategy, renegotiation is something that's also valued. You may implement a certain type of management to deal with a conflict at one point, let's say in an organization, and it may be very possible that in the future, that very same issue has to be dealt with again because there is still an issue taking place. Perhaps people are still stuck in old ways of thinking or old ways of dealing with things. And so it's important to note that the conflict orientations that we have tend to shape the attitudes we have about conflict, how willing we are to engage in conflict that is upfront and collaborative, and of course, what we do when we find ourselves in conflict with other people. According to your textbook, the Amish culture is one culture that views conflict as more destructive, but we can also look at other types of collective cultures, even just within the USA. Latin American or Latino culture tends to view conflict as highly destructive. We also tend to know that Japanese culture, Chinese culture, a lot of Asian cultures tend to view conflict as more destructive rather than positive or opportunity-based. However, the United States or other types of European cultures such as German American culture or perhaps Nordic American culture, those cultures tend to be more conflict as opportunity-based. And so, of course, what this means is that when we come into conflict interactions with people, we definitely want to think about our own orientation towards conflict and try to also get a sense of what another person or group's orientation to conflict is. Because if we understand each other going into the conflict, it's more likely that we can hopefully negotiate some of these differences when we're dealing with them through communication. Generally speaking, a conflict is based on a perception of incompatible values, goals, or behaviors. There can be many different types of conflicts that play out, and as you recall from earlier in this lecture, we've already talked about the different contexts of conflict, but now we're going to talk about various types of conflicts that can play out in relationships or between groups. So one type of conflict could be a conflict based on affect or how people feel about each other or about a certain situation. So one good example for affective conflict could be simply an interaction between a couple of people where there's a different view or different sentiment of emotion or perceptions of romance between two people. So sometimes you have things play out between friends where one person perhaps has a more romantic or loving orientation towards a friend of theirs, right? And maybe the other person only wants to keep things platonic and does not want to go romantic in the friendship or the interaction. So this could be a potential affect conflict. In addition, you might have varying degrees of romance. So let's say you have a couple that have been together for 6 months or a year. It's very likely, or possible at least, that one person may have certain types of feelings towards the other person, and although they are feelings of love and romance and things like that, it's possible that their feelings may not be as strong towards the other person as the other person's feelings are towards them, right? So that would be another good example of affect, or how people feel about each other, or of course you could look at how people feel about an issue as well. People may have varying levels of affect with regards to certain topics or issues in society, and of course these issues can also shape conflict. Another type of conflict deals with cognitive conflict. This deals with different perceptions that people have about appropriate communication or appropriate behavior or how we should do things. So an example of a cognitive conflict could be the cultural norm of different perceptions of touch cross-culturally. As we know from this semester and from our readings, there are many different cultures in the world that perceive that male and female touch behaviors should be isolated to the relationship that somebody has with their either family member or their partner in life, right? So what that means is that for other people that the person may know, there may be an expectation that men and women do not touch, right? Unless it's a family member or a romantic partner. And of course, when you come from a different culture than that, right? You may have an expectation that men and women shake hands, men and women touch, it's not a big deal. It's not seen as a very demonstrative communication behavior. Touch may be seen as something a lot more casual, cross-culturally, right? So we can see that cognitive perceptions of touch norms can be very different cross-culturally, and of course that can shape the way that we view issues and of course the way that we approach conflict as well. Another example of this would be the way in which men and women touch cross-culturally in terms of the same gender touching or the same sex touching. So sometimes you might notice that two women walking together, let's say two Chinese women, might be holding hands, okay? Now what that means in Chinese culture is that those two women are very good friends. They're best friends, in fact. And it does not indicate a romantic relationship. However, in the United States, when we see two women holding hands, generally speaking, people may have a certain conclusion about that, being that the two women are in a romantic relationship, right? So we can look at the ways that cross-cultural values can shape different perceptions of touch and what is considered to be appropriate touch in communication. We can also look at conflict in terms of conflicts based on values or right and wrong. So a very case in point example of a value conflict would be the value of the human life. So many people feel very strongly on either side of the argument about whether capital punishment should exist in certain types of criminal cases. Some people feel very strongly that it should not be a way of dealing with very intense or heinous types of crimes. Other people feel that it is something that is appropriate and that it should be something that is used to deal with crimes that are particularly terrible. So this is another example of a value conflict. And of course, people feel very strongly about these issues. So if we find ourselves in a conflict, it's always good to try to identify what is our own conflict orientation and what does it seem like the other person is oriented to in terms of their approach to conflict. And what is the conflict about? Is it a conflict based on affect? Is it a conflict based on values? Is it a conflict based on perception or cognition, right? Having this knowledge can help us approach the conflict with more competency. Another type of conflict deals with the conflict of interest or actions. Generally speaking, when there's a conflict of interest, people may perceive that there is, for example, a competition over, let's say, limited resources, okay? So you might find in some situations that maybe you're dealing with people who have a certain very fixed view of how they think that things should play out, and it may be that they are having that attitude or that conflict situation because they perceive that there are only a certain amount of resources to go around, right? And if that's the case, then of course, if I feel that I don't have enough of what I need for my family or my group, then I might start to perceive that there's a conflict, because maybe I might perceive that other groups or people are trying to solidify resources that I would like for my group, okay? So these are various types of conflict, and it's always good to try to be able to be clear about what kinds of conflicts are taking place, because then we can be more mindful about how to approach the conflict with more effective communication. When looking at various conflict management strategies, we can identify that there are 4 or 5 different types, and it's always good to understand these different strategies because we can start to figure out where do we lie in terms of our own approaches to conflict management, and how were we trained in our household to deal with conflict, and what are the expectations that we have for other people in conflict as well, based on our own cultural assimilation and socialization, growing up, and of course, learning about the world. So one conflict management strategy is the dominating style. The dominating style of conflict management has a high concern for self and a low concern for the other person. Generally speaking, people who have dominating communication management styles tend to be more loud, or at least they tend to be forceful in terms of how they're dealing with a conflict. And these types of situations tend to leave people who are experiencing the conflict with a dominating communicator. They tend to perceive that the other person is conveying to them that it's my way or the highway. So you tend to get that the dominating conflict style is not really the most ideal method. It tends to have a very low concern for the health or the benefit of the other person, and it has a very high concern for the self-interest and what a person or a group wants to establish for their own group. But of course, it's not very collaborative, it's not very compromising, and generally speaking, the dominating conflict management style, although people might win in the short term, generally speaking in relationships, it is not the ideal method, because as you can probably guess, when people are on the receiving end of a dominating communication style, they do not feel good about it, even if they might acquiesce in the short term. And so there can be a whole host of other issues that emerge later in the relationship because of the fact that they did not get their ideas, values, and feelings heard and considered when the conflict was being dealt with. So generally speaking, I do not encourage people to use the dominating style. However, if you find that you are someone who uses the dominating style, it is definitely something that you can become conscious of. And of course, you can work to adapt or be more flexible, because even though you might perceive that you get to win in the short term with the dominating style, there are potentially many very negative outcomes that can develop when somebody uses this style. And I'm not going to get into all of these negative long-term outcomes that can ensue when there is a dominating style of communication, but I encourage you to think through some of the negative long-term outcomes that can develop when people use this style, both in terms of the health of the person who uses the dominating style, and of course the health of the relationships that they have with other people, and of course the health of the people on the receiving end of a dominating communicator, okay? So you have long-term effects in terms of the relationship, you have long-term effects on the person who is on the receiving end of a dominating communicator, and you also actually have negative effects long-term that will end up influencing the person who is the dominating communicator, because generally speaking, people do not want to be dominated. And so even though they may win the fight, they might win the short-term fight, they will end up probably losing the battle long-term in one way or another. So this is definitely worth considering as you think about the types of conflict strategies that you would like to integrate into your communication style. A more effective conflict management strategy is that of the integrating style. The integrating conflict management style has a very high concern for the self, but it also has a very high concern for other people. And when we think about this style, isn't it true that most of us want to feel that we are valued and cared about and considered, right? This is a very human need to feel validated and cared about and like we are important or like we matter, right? So if you use the integrating style of communication or conflict, you are more likely to convey to other people that you care about them, you care about the relationship, and this is a highly effective strategy long-term in terms of effective relationships and, of course, effective work relationships, right? Or interpersonal, family, romantic relationships as well. Communication is open, honest, direct, assertive, but collaborative with the integrating style. So this style of communication suggests that people are going to be honest about how they feel and what their needs are, but they also are going to elicit information from the other person about what the other person wants and needs as well. One of the drawbacks potentially with the integrating style could be that it's very time consuming because it takes more time for people to genuinely discuss an issue. It may take time to figure out what people are feeling. It may take time to talk about it. Ultimately, you have to integrate the various needs that are on the table, right? However, the long-term effect of the integrating communication conflict management style is much more positive and more favorable because both parties tend to feel genuinely satisfied, okay? So this is definitely an approach that could yield much more positive outcomes than the dominating communication conflict management style. Another type of communication conflict management style is the style of compromising. This style tends to be used a lot in relationships. It also tends to be used a lot in organizations or in educational environments. And the compromising style has a moderate concern for both parties, okay, moderate concern for each person or moderate concern for each group involved. It is not as satisfying as the integrating style because each party generally has to give up a little bit of what they originally wanted. And one of the drawbacks is that there may be less commitment to the actual resolution that people come up with because of the fact that both parties had to give up a little bit, okay? So if you can achieve the integrating communication style, although it takes more time and resources to get there, the outcomes are more ideal long-term. However, realistically, sometimes a compromise is the only way to deal with a situation, right? So an example of a compromise would look like a situation where you agree that you will give in or you will give up one thing and the other person will give up another thing so that you can both have something else that's important to both of you, okay? So let's say that you have a conflict with one of your roommates about watching television or about how you're going to handle household chores or something, right? These are very sort of routine, mundane, normal conflicts that tend to happen when people live together, right? So if you are finding that your working and school schedule is making it very difficult for you to do any chores during the week, perhaps you can come up with a compromise and maybe your roommate wants to have chores done every single day or on a very set schedule, right? They want like mopping and sweeping done every day. They want laundry done on Mondays. The bathrooms get washed on Tuesdays, whatever. Well, if that doesn't work for your schedule, perhaps a compromise to that situation would be something along the lines of, okay, I understand that cleaning the house is very important to you. However, because of my work schedule, I'm not able to do that during the week, but I can commit all day Saturday to help us reach all of the clean and organizational needs that we have for the household. So I'm willing to give up my Saturday so that we can do the things we need to do so you feel good about the cleanliness in the house, but I am not able to commit that time during the week because my work and school schedule is so hectic, right? So that would be a good example of a compromising conflict management style or situation. Another conflict management approach is the obliging style. The obliging style tends to be one that emphasizes commonalities. However, it also tends to be a situation where people who tend to be in a lower power position tend to be the person who is obliging the needs, wants, or desires of the other person who's in a higher power position, usually. In the obliging situation, one person will usually satisfy the other person, and they will basically try to oblige or placate them to keep them happy, okay? The other thing that tends to characterize the obliging conflict management style is that people may downplay the differences and emphasize the commonalities, right? So one thing to be aware of with the obliging style, again, as with the dominating style of communication conflict, is that although it can work in the moment, or it can work short term to reduce or dissolve conflict, long term you may run into some problems, namely because of the fact that one person may be the one who's constantly giving in or obliging. And of course, what we know from the literature is that generally speaking, when people are feeling as if their needs and wants are not being met in a relationship, the quality of the relationship tends to suffer, okay? So although the obliging strategy might be a good short-term strategy to reduce conflict, I do not suggest using this style long-term, because chances are you will find that in the long-term course of the relationship, you will probably have even greater problems because the actual conflict is not really being dealt with, because one person is basically just placating the other person to keep them happy, okay? And as we know from the literature on relationships and power, when there is a major difference in terms of the power distribution in relationships, there tends to be problems, okay? If one person feels that their needs and their wants and their interests are not being considered and accounted for, ultimately long-term, that's going to be a problem in the relationship, all right? So we want to be conscious of this style, and perhaps you can think about where you fall in terms of your own preferred approach to managing conflict, and you can think about whether it's possible that maybe you may want to modify some of your conflict strategies so that you can be more effective. As I talked about a second ago, the power issue in terms of the obliging relationship or the obliging management style is a real issue. And as I said before, the short-term solution may work as a pseudo-solution, but long-term, the obliging style tends to not be very effective in terms of genuine, mutually satisfying communication and relationships. The final conflict management style that we want to be conscious of is that of the avoiding or the avoider. The avoider tends to have a very low concern for the self, and they also have a low concern for others. Now, generally speaking, we want to say that these types of conflict management styles were developed by people who are from Western culture, all right? And so what that means is that if I were to say that the avoiding conflict style has a low concern for self and a low concern for others, it may not be the case that everybody who uses avoidance has a low concern for self or others. It may actually be the case that some cultures tend to avoid conflict in order to maintain group harmony, right? So we want to be careful of assuming that anyone who does avoidance has a low concern for self and for others. And what this points out in terms of these different conflict strategies is that there is a Western cultural bias inherent in these conflict management approaches, okay? And there is some research that's been done that looks at different approaches to communication. So for example, one of your secondary textbook by Samovar and Porter talks about Yoshi Meike and how he talks about an Asian-centric view of communication. And so that would be a type of approach to communication that may have an Asian bias, right? But it probably would not have a Western bias because it was developed by someone who's from Japan, and so he has a very Asian-centric view of the world. So in terms of communication strategies, we tend to find that the avoidance strategy tends to deny the conflict or withdraw from the conflict prior to it being resolved. However, avoiders tend to not be viewed very positively. Avoiders in Western, more direct cultures tend to be viewed more negatively. Now, if you're coming from a collective culture, and especially a culture that tends to view conflict as something that's destructive, people who avoid conflict might actually be viewed very positively, right? So again, we want to be careful of that cultural bias that's inherent in these different categories, especially with regards to how avoiders are viewed. And generally speaking, as I said on this slide, there is a cultural bias with most research, right? And so we want to be conscious of that. We also want to be conscious of the fact that avoiding conflict is not a good strategy usually for ideal, mutually satisfying communication and, of course, relationships. So I encourage you to think about where you fall on the conflict management paradigm and on the sort of I want to say it's a gradation, right? You have 5 categories, and so on one hand you have more of the dominating style, and then on the other hand you have the avoiding style. So think about where you fall in terms of these conflict management approaches. Ask yourself, where did you learn this approach? Where did you learn that there was one approach that was better than the other? And how do you think this conflict management approach has influenced your life, either positively or perhaps less positively, right? And if you find that there are some approaches that you're currently using that you think are not effective or that are not working as well as you would like, then you can always modify your approach so that you can be more effective in your communication and, of course, in your relationships with other people. Productive conflict can be dealt with most effectively when we do several things. One of the first things is we need to narrow down the definition of the issue and our focus. What this means is that you need to deal with one conflict issue at a time rather than attempting to deal with several issues at the same time. The reason for this is because having to try to deal with several issues at the same time gets very complicated, and usually it can be pretty overwhelming for people. And so I strongly suggest that if you're having a conflict with someone, that you deal with the most pressing important issue first, and then you can make an appointment or set up a time in the future to deal with the other issues that are important. You can even write down the issues and deal with them one by one if you need to. But I strongly encourage you to make sure that you narrow down your issue and your focus rather than attempting to talk about every single problem that you have with a person or a group of people all at once. This is very important because this is the best way to achieve an effective, mutually satisfying resolution by dealing with the conflicts one at a time rather than trying to throw them all together and dealing with them all together. The second thing to do, which is related to the first thing, is to make sure that you limit the discussion in the conflict based on the original issue that you're dealing with, okay? So a lot of times there may be more than one issue that people are dealing with in relationships, and so it's tempting to talk about another issue that may be related somehow, but really we need to make sure that we limit the discussion and the conflict so that we focus on the original issue, and then if there are other issues that need to be addressed, we can go back and deal with those issues later on once the original conflict issue has been managed and effectively dealt with. The third thing that we want to do is we want to direct the conflict toward problem solving. What this means is that you do not want to use the conflict as an opportunity to show the other person that they're getting what they deserve, or for punishing people, or for venting on people, right? One of the most important things that we can learn as effective communicators is to take a time out. Anytime any person in the conflict is starting to feel angry or stressed or sad, or you see a heightened emotion response, this is a very good time to call what they call as a timeout. Okay, the experts all suggest this strategy, and a timeout is basically when two people or two parties agree to take a timeout to go and calm down and regroup. The reason that the experts suggest that people take timeouts when they have conflict is because when people get emotionally upset, the brain does not process information very effectively, because as soon as you become upset, the amygdala, which is the fight or flight response in the human brain, the amygdala becomes stimulated, and of course what that means is that your body and your brain begin to focus on survival rather than on logical decision making. And so when you calm down again and you get to a place where you're feeling calm and centered instead of agitated and upset, you're more likely to use better strategies to manage conflict, and you're also more likely to say things that are going to effectively bring the conflict towards resolution rather than using short-circuit thinking or venting or yelling or punishing behaviors, okay? So always direct the conflict and the communication towards problem solving rather than towards punishing people, venting, sabotaging other people, trying to make them look bad or feel bad, or things like that. Another thing to do is to emphasize trust and also to get people to help you manage a conflict in some situations where you need help. So if you need a mediator or a counselor or perhaps a trusted elder in your community, those are people that can be enlisted to help accommodate and mediate when there are different viewpoints or different needs and wants. And this is actually, the mediation process is actually something that is used quite frequently in legal disputes or in various types of social and individual conflicts that may happen. And so if you feel like you're not able to manage the conflict yourself, then enlist the help of someone that you trust who you think can emphasize mutual satisfaction between you and the other party, or between your group and the other group. In comparison to effective conflict, destructive conflict includes communication that tends to escalate ideas, emotions, or issues, and escalates negative attitudes. So again, I talked about this issue on the previous slide of using a conflict as an opportunity to vent on somebody or to make them feel bad or to punish them. This is not a constructive conflict approach, and anytime we find that the conflict is escalating, it's a great time to take a timeout so that both parties can calm down, refocus, and remember why it is that they're even engaging in a discussion about the conflict at all, right? And the whole point of engaging in conflict is to ideally reach a resolution that is satisfying for both parties. So escalating negative attitudes and heightened emotions is a destructive conflict strategy that you want to work to avoid whenever possible. Another destructive conflict issue is expanding the talk to other issues, okay? Now, we talked about this on the previous slide. You want to make sure that when you talk about conflict, that you are focused on the main issue of importance. If there are other issues that need to be dealt with at a future time, you can write down what those issues are in terms of and especially in terms of their priority. How important is it that the issue gets dealt with soon? And then you can go back later and you can talk about those issues once you have already resolved the original issue. You want to make sure that you stay focused, and if the other person in the conflict is discussing lots of other issues all at once, you need to do your best to try to bring them back to the original issue. Another thing that doesn't work effectively with conflict is the use of deception or lying, coercion or manipulation, or mismanaging power. Whenever we are in a position where we perceive that we have more power than somebody, we have to be careful that we don't perceive that that stance gives us a legitimate right to abuse our power so that we can get what we want, even at the expense of another person's livelihood. So generally speaking, you do not want to use deception or lying. You do not want to use coercion or manipulation. And you definitely don't want to try to use your power position to try to oppress people or force your opinion or force your desired outcome on other people, okay? As we've talked about before, this strategy may work in the short term because you may end up getting what you want in that moment. But in the long term, this strategy is highly ineffective, and actually it contributes to even greater conflict, and it tends to exacerbate conflict, okay? So I strongly encourage you to do your best to avoid deception, coercion, or mismanaging power anytime you're dealing with conflict. In addition, one thing that we need to remember when we are engaging in conflict is that there are multiple viewpoints for any issue, right? There are potentially several different viewpoints for viewing the very same issue, right? So what that means is that our viewpoint is not always necessarily the right one. And in fact, if we can approach conflict with an open mind, with an attitude that seeks to understand, rather than an attitude that seeks to judge and conclude, then we will be much more effective in terms of understanding other people, identifying what their needs are, and hopefully trying to reach a resolution where both parties' needs are being met effectively. There are many things that we can do to cope with conflict effectively. The first thing we can do is stay calm and keep an open mind. The second thing we can do is maintain contact with people. So what this means is that maybe you need to take some time to yourself to try to figure out what you're thinking or figure out what your needs are. But if you do need to do that, make sure that you're in communication with other people about the fact that you need some time to figure out what you're feeling or figure out what your needs are, and that you plan to come back together to talk about the issue at a future time when you're calm and when you can be more open to hearing their perspective as well. Another thing that I can do in order to be effective when I have conflict is to work to acknowledge the fact that we all have different coping strategies when we're faced with conflict. So some of us tend to avoid conflict. Others tend to face conflict with a very integrating perspective, right? Some of us tend to want to dominate other people during conflict because of the way that we were raised. And so we need to acknowledge that we have different coping styles, and that all of us, regardless of how effective we think we are with our communication, all of us can probably improve the way that we approach conflict in some way or another, okay? So we acknowledge that there are different coping styles, and we also acknowledge that we want to be open to managing our coping strategy or to modifying our coping strategy depending on who we're interacting with, what their needs are, and what the overall needs of the situation are as well. Effective conflict coping also includes identifying our preferred style of conflict management. What this means is that if you find yourself communicating with someone who has a dominating communication style, you could actually inform them that you prefer to communicate in a more integrative style, and you could explain what that means, or in a compromising style, and you could give them a choice of modifying their communication style. So ideally, both people are able to identify their preferred style and use a style that is healthy and effective for managing conflict. Namely, we should probably work to use an integrating style or a compromising style of communication rather than the other styles whenever possible. Another thing that we can do is we can work to expand the style of coping or conflict management that we use. What this means is that if we tend to find that we are using a style that's not very effective, then we can manage that by using a more effective communication style. For example, maybe you might tend to see that you are more of an avoider, and as we know from the literature, avoiding communication styles or avoiding conflict styles tend to be subpar in terms of the overall long-term outcomes. So you could work to be more integrating or more collaborative. Another thing to be aware of is context issues as they relate to conflict. So you want to be very careful about choosing a context to communicate during your conflict management that is appropriate. You want to choose an area or a situation where you can have privacy if you need it, where you can both feel safe to communicate your thoughts, needs, and desires without being heard by other people or without feeling ridiculed or anything like that. So you want to obviously choose a place where both people can communicate effectively and they both feel safe. Another thing to think about is whether you're engaging in conflict in person or whether it's over the phone or whether it's via text messaging. Generally speaking, it is not ideal to have conflict resolutions taking place via text message or email. This is because it is very difficult to gauge how people are feeling, and various types of message cues that can help us see how people are feeling will be lost if we use more written means of coping. So generally speaking, you want to try to have conflict resolved either in a face-to-face mode or at the very least via telephone, so at least you can get a sense of people's emotional tone and what's going on for people emotionally when they're talking about the various types of issues. And finally, we need to always work on forgiveness. Forgiveness is something that has been found in the literature on mental, physical, and emotional health to be very effective for promoting ideal health for people. Also, there are many different types of religious backgrounds that tend to talk a lot about the importance of forgiveness, and the benefits of forgiveness are not only on the other person in terms of forgiving them for what they've done, but actually the benefits of forgiveness are much wider reaching, in that if we are able to forgive when other people do us wrong, we ourselves will be more liberated and free and generally more happy because we're not holding on to negative affect or anger or resentment, which, as the research shows, has been found to have a very negative impact on mental health, physical health, and emotional health for human beings. We can also think of forgiveness in terms of forgiving individuals, so other people or even ourselves sometimes when we do things that we're not proud of. But we can also think of forgiveness in a more collective framework. So it may be possible that you have certain attitudes or negative feelings towards a group or groups in society because of perceptions of an injustice that your group in society or you personally have experienced because of that other group, right? So we can look at collective resentment as a type of collective emotion that can be alleviated if we choose to forgive. Now, sometimes forgiveness is something that people have to choose to do every single day. You're going to choose to forgive somebody that has done you wrong every single day when you wake up, right? Forgiveness is not something that's necessarily easy to do, but forgiveness has many, many positive outcomes, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of forgiveness in terms of mutually satisfying and effective relationships with ourselves and also with other people, and also long-term health outcomes. So hopefully this lecture has provided some useful ideas for you in terms of understanding conflict, and hopefully from this lecture you've taken away a greater understanding of the way that you approach conflict and your expectations for how conflict should be managed. And ideally, when you are able to think about some of these issues on a greater level, if you feel like there are some things that you could modify to be more effective, I strongly encourage you to start working on that. And in addition, hopefully this lecture has given you a framework for how to approach conflict when you find yourself dealing with it. And remember that one of the most important things with regards to effective conflict is taking a time out when you or another person or party is starting to feel angry, sad, or upset. The reason that we take the time out is so that we can allow the amygdala brain region to calm down, because once the amygdala is not stimulated, and generally speaking, when we get upset, our amygdala becomes activated, and then we have reduced thinking quality. We have less logic, we have less cohesion in terms of our thoughts and coherence. So generally speaking, the most important thing for us to think about during conflict is the ability to identify when people are starting to get heated and the ability to take a time out so that we can regroup, calm down, and then approach the conflict again with a level head and with more rational decision making and thought processing. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that this lecture was useful for you, and I will talk to everyone in the last lecture.